Welcome back, my lords and ladies, to the Cast Beyond the Wall. We are your guide to all things Westerosi, and we're here to bring you a review, an analysis, and a fan v fan debate on each episode of HBO's Game of Thrones successor series, House of the Dragon. In today's discussion, we're going to provide our initial reactions to the House of the Dragon series premiere before providing a breakdown of the story, as well as our thoughts and analysis of some of the scenes. And then we'll close out the show today by speculating about what we think might happen next. I'm your host, Caleb Masters, and I'd like to raise a glass to Austin of House Lucari, host for an episode. And joining me today, returning to me from the Riverlands of Southern Illinois. Sir, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Daniel Stoll, and I've never been to like an official like jousting tournament, but don't plan on going anytime soon because apparently you can just get mad and murder your opponent if things don't go well.
Daniel, you and I went to medieval times together multiple times. You don't remember the bloody deaths and the bodies on the ground?
Yeah, don't recall that. I must have just wiped that from my memory because I don't think it's supposed to go down that way.
The Red Knight went down, that's for sure. Well, I'm also so excited to reintroduce you all to our returning guest. He is the watcher of all stories. He is the knower of all things pop culture. He is LaRon Chapman, the Tenderhearted. LaRon, welcome back.
Very sweet. Thanks for having me. Yeah, if it's, what is it, blood, brothels, and incest, I mean, it must be Game of Thrones.
That's right. You're in. Oh, man. LaRon, it's so good to have you back. So longtime listeners, may remember from our previous seasons that LaRon was one of our recurring guest hosts, and he was so generous to rejoin us again this year. And, man, it's a whole new ball game, but it's also the same ball game all at the same time. So excited to talk about it with you, LaRon.
Yeah, absolutely.
And listeners, of course, you can track all of our posts here on the Cast Beyond the Wall on our social media channels, including our Twitter. That's at cast_beyond_GOT. And you can look us up on Facebook at facebook.com/Cast Beyond the Wall. Now, before we get into today's conversation, I just wanted to go over a few quick announcements and housekeeping things. First up, Daniel, did you notice anything about the podcast feed this week?
Yeah, there's some new cover art, I believe, right?
Yeah, new cover art. That's right. Ladies and gentlemen, we finally retired the three-eyed raven that was designed by former co-host Austin Lucari. It served us well. However, this is the House of the Dragon, and I am very doubtful that we will encounter the three-eyed raven in this particular series. So with that said, Lauren Weingart, a.k.a. Video Peach, a.k.a. my fiance, did me a very nice solid to put together a new logo. Hopefully it still looks familiar to longtime listeners. We still have a creature wearing headphones, but it is a new look that I think is going to match a little more of the tone and the vibe that we're going with House of the Dragon. So Lauren Weingart, a.k.a. Video Peach, thank you so much. And again, Video Peach Production. Next up, if you like that cover art, or you like this banter, or shit talking as we like to call it, you can help us out. We need you to rate and review this podcast, specifically on Apple and Spotify. So this podcast has been published to Spotify since the last season happened, and Spotify has actually added a feature that lets you rate a podcast. The trick is you got to listen to the episode, at least one episode first, but once you do that, you will be able to rate the podcast 5 stars. And ladies and gentlemen, now more than ever, if you're a Spotify listener, please, it takes you listen to an episode. I know that takes an hour and a half or whatever, but rate us. It takes you 5 seconds. It's the easiest thing. You go up to the top on the app, right underneath the title, there's a star. You click it, pulls it up, click 5 stars. You're done. Apple Podcast listeners, this also, when you also have the opportunity not only to rate us, but leave us a review, please do it. Just all of this is going to help us get discovered by more listeners like you. And there's a lot of Game of Thrones podcasts out there. So the more ratings we have, the better. Gotta compete in this fierce Game of Thrones battle for Game of Thrones podcasts, apparently. Lastly, concerning spoilers, let's just quickly go around the table. Have we read Fire and Blood? Daniel, have you read Fire and Blood?
I have not. The only books I've read within the Game of Thrones universe is just the main series of books.
All right, so Fire and Blood, that is the histories that this show, House of the Dragon, is based on. LaRon Chapman, have you read Fire and Blood?
I have not. My full understanding of this show comes from all of the shows that have come out. So
I think that's fair. I think that's a really great way to go into it. I myself very nearly have not read it. I've only read 120 pages. That's right, listeners. Those of you who tuned in last week, I'm only advanced 20 pages. So I know. I'm a slow reader. Things are busy. Got a lot of podcasting to do here. But I actually don't know a lot myself. So just want to make it explicitly clear, we are not going to be spoiling any future events of House of the Dragon, at least not intentionally. If we theorize about it, just know that these are genuine theories. Once I accumulate advanced knowledge as I read, I promise you, you will not know anything that happens down the line. We're keeping this spoiler free. We're talking about everything that happens through this episode and maybe a little bit about the next time on. One thing we're going to talk about related to House of the Dragon here is that this premiere turns out smash hit. Because according to HBO, the House of the Dragon series premiere was watched by 9.99 million viewers across all platforms, making it the biggest HBO series premiere ever, beating out such shows as Euphoria Season 2, I think was the previous record holder for biggest premiere. Guys, great news. Spinoffs forever, baby. Westeros forever. Especially if the new Warner Brothers Discovery leadership has anything to say about it. But I just wanted to pause with that and ask you guys, are you surprised? Because I know myself, we actually questioned whether this podcast was going to happen because we weren't sure if there was going to be enough interest left in the series. Daniel, does that sort of a smash hit for House of the Dragon surprise you?
It actually does surprise me. I thought that a lot of, obviously with the internet, there has been a lot of hate towards the last season of Game of Thrones, and even people saying it ruined the whole show for them. And so I thought there would be a lot of people dissuaded by that information. And so I am surprised to see that many people tuned in right off the bat and didn't sort of wait to see if there were reviews and then pick it up later, something like that. Because that's the thing with streaming, right? Is you can wait a couple weeks and then just pick it up and binge it and catch up. So I am surprised that many people showed up right out of the gate. We actually, on our podcast, it felt like we're a little bit less of the downers than the majority of the people like online. So I was a little surprised, but I think that, Game of Thrones definitely established a certain sort of reputation despite the ending. And I don't think the ending ruins that whole show at all. So I think people were excited to see if it could sort of return to its former glory. And so that it makes sense that people showed up. I was just expecting to be groundbreaking premiere numbers.
And I want to make it clear, I do genuinely think there was a big question, even from some of the stuff I've read online, even at HBO initially, not that it would be popular, but is this going to be a hit? There was even a question among some like people who are really in the know in the entertainment industry who cover Game of Thrones about, if this isn't a hit, like we might not even get a second season. That was because this is a very expensive show still. So I think it was fair for us to have those reservations, Daniel. Laurent, what's your take on the numbers here?
Yeah, I think to a certain extent it's surprising, but also I just think that the marketing for this has been really great. They've done a really good job of at least piquing curiosity about what else could we discover within this universe. And I think honestly, just hearing people's conversations, side conversations as we've gotten closer to the date, there's been a lot of chatter. So I could tell that people were interested in it, even just the passing fans, So even if there was, any kind of disappointment with the concluding, seasons of Game of Thrones, there was still like this huge wealth of fan base for this series that I think even if they're a little bitter, they still want to know, again, can it return to that former state, And I think as we'll get into it later, I think maybe it will.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, I think that's a good point. I guess down to your point, I'm surprised it's the biggest series premiere ever. It probably shouldn't be because the thing is the marketing has been killer. And actually just on Friday, there was a internal memo over at HBO that got leaked from the new Warner Brothers Discovery CEO, David Zaslav, who said this is the most successful marketing campaign for HBO of all time. Like it reached more, like the marketing for House of the Dragon reached more people than even the Game of Thrones final season marketing reached. The other thing I think, I don't know how much of a factor it is. I do know a handful of people who didn't watch Game of Thrones when it was on, who like once it was done, mainlined it and like watched all 8 seasons. I wouldn't say there's a ton of them, but I know people who did that. So I think it's a combo of there have been probably a handful of new fans who've developed since the series concluded. But also, again, the nostalgia is a hell of a drug, guys. Mm-hmm. And especially I've been sort of doing not a full rewatch yet, but on my 4K Ultra HD Blu-rays, I've been checking on certain episodes to see, hey, how did this look in like with the highest quality possible? Yeah. And when I watched, I'm like, damn, this is great TV. I know the show's not perfect, but either whether it's a great like dialogue scene, just two people in a room, or some of the battle sequences truly are incredible. In fact, I would say I don't know if it's the new format or the way they remastered it or whatever, but Laurent, you and I have talked extensively on the cinematic schematic about how the VFX on like Marvel movies, for example, just seem to get worse and worse. Mm-hmm. I think the Game of Thrones show, especially in that last season, looks just as good, if not, actually, no, I'm going to say I think it looks better than a lot of like $200 million theatrically released Marvel films.
Yeah, the show,
yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I say all that to say, surprised to a degree. Okay. So that is Game of Thrones. Great news for this podcast. It is only job security for Daniel and I that we will continue to have things to talk about forever, apparently. All right, gentlemen. Well, without further ado, it's time to get into our review and breakdown of this week's episode of The House of the Dragon, Heirs of the Dragon.
10 years you've been king, and yet not once have you asked me to be your hand.
Why would I do that?
Because I'm your brother.
So according to IMDb, the official synopsis for Heirs of the Dragon reads as, Viserys hosts a tournament to celebrate the birth of his second child. Rhaenyra welcomes her uncle Daemon back to the Red Keep. So just real quick, before we get into the sort of the scene-by-scene breakdown, I want to do a pulse check with you guys. See, hey, what did you think? What did you like about this episode? What didn't you like, maybe? So, Daniel, I'm starting with you. What did you think of the series premiere of House of the Dragon?
I actually thought it was a pretty solid pilot. I wasn't blown away. We got to meet a lot of the characters, and in Game of Thrones fashion, I can't remember every single character's name right off the top of my head, but we'll get to know them, of course, as the season goes on. But I felt like there was a pretty solid introduction for most of the characters. We got to see two dragons, and we also, had the very Game of Thrones style tournament, which I think was actually, the more that I think about it, is actually pretty important for this series, but we can get into that a little bit later. And it definitely has me intrigued to learn more. And I think specifically Daemon, his presence in this episode really sort of took over this episode and is really one of the main reasons I want to come back to see what happens with his character, despite maybe that he's not the greatest person, but
this is Game of Thrones, Daniel. They're never the greatest people.
Well, but also it is Game of Thrones, and so there is already some gray elements to his character, I think, which is really interesting. And one other thing, I thought it was actually kind of really cool that we had sort of the opening with Harrenhal. So we made the reference, sort of the, and we can get into that in a little bit too, but just seeing a place that we already know about, but in an entirely different context than what we're used to. When we see it in Game of Thrones, it's destroyed and it's been burned and all that stuff, to open in this like place that we know, but it looks nothing like we think it should. I thought it was pretty cool. Yeah, I think it was a really good, solid opener.
Very nice. Solid opener. We have one thumbs up from Daniel Stoll. Laurent Chapman, what did you think?
Yeah, I enjoyed it. I went into it again like everybody else did, kind of with a little bit of trepidation, but I like that they're taking their time, to develop these characters. I know for some people, you want the pilot to be a slam dunk of just spectacle, but I really think that it would do a disservice to a good series if we didn't spend time getting to know the characters we're about to meet. So I felt like I liked the slow burn of the episode. I liked because it became kind of very quietly absorbing, instead of streamlining it in the service of ultraviolence and sex, which there's plenty of that in it as well. But still felt like a reintroduction to this universe, and it is again 200 almost 200 years in the past. So it has a different vibe to it and a similar vibe. It's kind of spreading, splitting the fence there with that in terms of feeling new and fresh, and then also somewhat familiar. So
yeah, I think that's spot on, Laurent, because I'm just going to echo what both you and Daniel are both saying. I had my concerns. Let's just put it that way. I was somewhat conservative with my expectations, hoping for the best, but preparing for the worst. And I think this episode is definitely a very strong first episode. Because that's the other thing that I always try to remind people is, like, first episode, you're really not going to, like it's like you said, Laurent, they're not going to show up guns a-blazing, with all this big spectacle necessarily in the first episode. And I'm glad they didn't, because I think it's a nice way for them to signal, hey, we know what you like about Game of Thrones. And yeah, we have some cool violence set pieces in this episode, but really the show is grounded in these individual interactions between characters, the setting, the clear political underpinnings of everything that's said, I think is really compelling. All of that, I think, really puts a lot of my concerns at ease, that they understand that the final season of Game of Thrones, while not bad, also did not really capture the full essence of why people fell in love with the show and the first 4 seasons, say. I think this episode does a much better job at balancing those two. Because the other thing, to echo what Daniel said, the production values on this are, I couldn't get over it. I was like, man, the cinematography on this is slick. The costumes look incredible. The score's never been better. It's just one of those things. It's like, this is people across every sort of craft and every single part of the production putting in like their A+ game because they know how big a deal this series is, versus, maybe season 1 of Game of Thrones. It's not that people weren't working hard, but the budget wasn't there, and the certainty of, viewership wasn't there. And I think, whether or not they knew if the show was going to be a hit, they knew a lot of people were going to be watching. And like I said earlier, they knew that in a lot of ways, the future of this entire franchise sort of rested on, can we make a damn good first episode? And I think they succeeded on that front. So just one last question on that. I mean, did this show really recapture the essence and spirit of what made Game of Thrones special to you? LeBron, I'll throw it back to you.
Yeah, it has like the requisite like world building and, like you mentioned, like the really like amazing costuming and cinematography that we come to expect from this show. But it does also feel like its own animal, like it does kind of feel like and I like that it feels somewhat like a distant cousin to the series in a way, which I guess in a way it kind of is. It's like, it just feels like there's something new to explore here. Cause if it felt so on the nose and it felt so much like, what we've seen before, then it wouldn't really warrant 10 episodes of interest, So I feel like the fact that I'm not exactly sure how we know how some things, where they're going to go, but the inner workings to how we get to those places is what's going to be interesting for this show. And that at least the foundation for that is set in the first episode. And I think I'm intrigued enough to see how it gets to where it goes. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and Daniel hinted at this earlier, where we kind of get like the sweeping shots on the dragon of King's Landing. It does a really great job, to your point, LeBron, saying, hey, remember this? It's not how you remember it, but you remember it's there. And also there's that sense of like, sort of, I don't want to say like it's a little foreboding, because sort of where things are going in Game of Thrones. But I think sort of the fun is where this show is going to go on its own. And again, not to beat a dead horse for listeners who tuned into our preview episode last week, but we just came off of Better Call Saul, which I thought did an incredible job of showing, hey, we're part of the same universe. We're just telling our own story. There's a lot of crossover in some of the themes, but the execution, while clearly a part of the same family, a cousin, so to speak, is still doing its own thing. And also, it really proved to me that absolutely you can do a prequel where you have just as much, if not more, suspense and drama than in a sequel. I think it's all about, what can the writers muster. And I think by showing us familiar places that we've seen before, Daniel, and by also, in some very clever ways that we'll get into, sort of tie what's happening here into the larger story of Game of Thrones, all of that kind of works to set the table and create a new framework for the show, or a sandbox for the show to play in. Daniel, how about you? Did you feel like this really recaptured the essence?
I think in some ways it did. As Lauren was saying, there is a little bit of a different feeling with it, and maybe it's just because it's the first episode and that's all we've seen, but I definitely got a season 1 Game of Thrones vibe with this a little bit. Just a lot of like the talking, and it is the pilot, but we didn't have a lot of explosive stuff, but there was the hand and the king in a council room talking, and it was interesting. Like very season 1, season 2, season 3-esque Game of Thrones. So I like, and those are my favorite parts of Game of Thrones. So I like that. But I also think it was maybe one of the most difficult scenes I've ever had to watch in Game of Thrones happened during this. And so sort of establishing like, we're not Game of Thrones wasn't afraid to like hold back in some ways. And this show sort of establishing very early on in this episode, we're not holding back. This is still the brutal world that you left when you left Game of Thrones. And I think they did recapture some of that and establish that that this is still going to be that same sort of universe, even though there is sort of there's different characters and a different story. And I'm excited, and we're excited to see where they go. I think it captured enough of it with still being different. And I think that's a really hard balance to hit, but I think it hit it.
Well said. So we are all generally very pro on the premiere. Let's get into the episode, shall we? So I just want to quickly start off, Daniel, as you mentioned earlier, we have a prologue that is set in Harrenhal. And this is probably, I would say, the most Lord of the Rings I feel like Game of Thrones has ever felt, because it's like, we've got a voiceover. In this year, this thing happened, and this thing happened, and here's this thing happening. And I didn't mind it, by the way. And Harrenhal looked stunning. I just have to say, it was a really cool sequence. So we start off with King Jaehaerys Targaryen. He's at the end of his life and sadly has lost both of his sons. And to prevent a civil war, he decides to hold a great council meeting that summons thousands of lords from across the Seven Kingdoms. And according to the narrator, 14 successors were considered, but ultimately it really only came down to 2. We had Princess Rhaenys Targaryen, who is the oldest granddaughter, aka the queen that never was, and then the Prince Viserys Targaryen, who was the oldest grandson. And again, the latter, Viserys, was chosen largely because the patriarchy, because more lords wanted to stick with a man than bring a woman into power. And again, that's how she became known as the queen who never was by her supporters. And then sort of this monologue ends with a really, kind of chilling line. The only thing Jaehaerys knew, that the only thing that could tear down the house was the house itself. Cue title card, House of the Dragon. I thought that was a nice touch. So just really quickly, I have a few details I want to hit on here, but I wanted to just get you guys' take here. Did anything particularly striking stick out to you about this prologue, either stylistically or from a world building or story standpoint? Daniel?
Yeah, I think you definitely hit it on the head. This definitely gave me beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring sort of vibe for at least a brief minute there with the voiceover that was going on. And I actually think, interestingly, I like I said, I don't know anything that's going to happen in this season. I haven't read anything, but I feel like they really established what the conflict of this whole season is going to be in the first 5 minutes of the show, of this family strife and drama, civil war. I don't know if anyone ever said civil war, but that was sort of the vibe that I was getting, is you're going to have
definitely a civil war.
Yeah. Just straight off the bat, like they said, this is what the conflict's going to be. And I think that really interesting, and I'm excited to see how that plays out. That to me was stood out as like giving me that sort of, here's what you should be looking for as we're moving forward. And I like that. It gives me some place to sort of stand and know what I'm watching. It was cool to see Harrenhal. We had heard about Harrenhal and how great of a place it was, and it was cool to see it standing and just in the epicness of it a little bit.
Yeah, like kind of sets the tone. Laurent Chapman, what did you make of this opening prologue?
Yeah, stylistically for me, I also wrote down Lord of the Rings, but it also kind of gave me just a lot of the inherent misogyny that kind of exists in this hierarchy. Reminds me a lot of the parallels that we see in our own political system. And I found it really, some parallels that one thing I kind of noted, the 2016 election came to mind as the episode kind of continues on. Was just that how we've pitted, an unqualified man and this qualified woman, for the same position, but the attitudes towards who should hold that, kind of get overshadowed, with that inherent misogyny where it's like, we'd rather have a man at all costs than have somebody that might be qualified for this particular role. But it also kind of is foreshadowing for me in many ways, like how the roles of women in power and that power dynamic, how that's going to start shifting as the series goes on. And as we know from seeing the actual series, that women do start to assert themselves in pretty impactful ways. So I thought it was a subtle way of introducing those tensions, within the hierarchy.
Yeah, absolutely. And here's one thing I want to call out on that note, Laurent Chapman, and this is maybe a bigger debate that's going on online, and we don't necessarily need to solve it right now. But, I think both the producers of this show during sort of their initial press tour, but also George R. Martin have recently been asked, like, why do you hate women? Why do you portray women in such a disempowered way? And he's like, George R. Martin's like, I write them how they exist in the real world. Some people don't like that, like that he writes that way. I personally think, I mean, it's all about what he set out to do, which is tell a dark fantasy that is a reflection of our own reality. And with that, I mean, 2016 election, you can name it. There's so many examples in our current everyday life, others parallels that we'll get into later, where you're like, yeah, the world sucks, and they're not afraid to portray it in a pretty graphic or upsetting fashion in this show. It doesn't work for some people. I personally tend to, as a white cis male, tend to appreciate it because it challenges me in how I think about things. But I know that there are a lot of people online who are not big fans of how they've kind of built the world up this way, right? Just a couple of fun facts here. I think you guys hit on everything, but King Jaehaerys, played by our boy Bib Fortuna from Star Wars.
They wanna wonder.
Anyone? Any other Star Wars fans? Bib Fortuna, Jabba the Hutt's right hand. Yeah, come on. Okay.
Yeah.
See, Boba Fett came in and took him out last season, and he's like, I got to go find a new throne to sit on. And this one, he's like, crap, I'm some decrepit old man. But anyway, no speaking lines, but he's in this. The actor who plays Bib Fortuna is in there, which I thought was pretty fun. And another fun fact that I picked up while watching sort of the behind the scenes, which, by the way, there was a very short 6-minute version of the episode recap from the creative team at the very end. But also, if you go on HBO Max, if you go into the menus, there is a 26-minute version of the behind the scenes. It's crazy. And so essentially, the Harrenhal set, they weren't done building it, and they were having to like put it together at the same time. So they had a guy, I guess, I don't know his title, but I assume like the art director of some sort, was on the set drawing what the rest of it would look like.
Oh, man.
He was prevising on an iPad while they were shooting it. It's crazy, just insane. Insane how good it looks, because I really liked sort of this like, it's CG, but it kind of had this fantasy vibe to it.
An opulence to it, yeah.
Almost like you're in like, say, some sort of cathedral, for example, which was really nice. But yeah, anyway, just a couple fun facts for you. But let's move on here. And here where it feels just as much like Lord of the Rings. For the first time ever, we get an on-screen prompt that tells us this story is happening 172 years before the Mad King Aerys is killed by Jaime Lannister and Daenerys Targaryen is born. That's what roughly where we're at today. Flashback to Civil War times, American Civil War times, I should say. We get a cool opening. We're reintroduced to King's Landing, as Daniel mentioned earlier. We get to see dragons, which is a great vehicle for us to witness and see a bird's eye view of King's Landing as it was before Game of Thrones, because again, when we see it in Game of Thrones, it's actually pretty run down. We also get the introduction of Rhaenyra, who is played here by Millie Alcock, one of 2 actresses who will play her this season. I just wanted to get you guys' take here. I mean, what did you think of this very showy reintroduction of King's Landing? Laurent?
No, I really enjoyed it. It's really nice seeing it in this light. I mean, because we've only ever heard it articulated verbally before now. And so seeing it now, like where the dragons are flying around like the crows in the sky, it just feels like like this, again, similar to the whole show itself, pitted against Game of Thrones. It feels familiar, but also kind of new and different. And what's fascinating is just kind of seeing how much of the politicking and this whole universe feels, it feels different and the same, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, because at this point they are in a peacetime. There's no war, right. And they've actually been prosperous for, it sounds like 100 or so years where there's not been any wars. It's because Jaehaerys was also a peacetime king, if I have my note correctly here. So you're talking about 2 generations of kings where there was no war, things were prosperous, there was peace, right? Yeah, I kind of like that. You're like, this is a political climate that is different. Yeah. Familiar, but different. Daniel, how about you? What did you think about the sort of reintroduction to King's Landing this season?
It was cool to see. I think it's interesting that we get this scene so quick because the last time we saw a person on a dragon flying over King's Landing, they were burning it to the ground. And so then the first scene that we get of King's Landing with the dragon flying over it, kind of like Laurent said, it's like very normal thing. Everything's great. Everything looks wonderful. And it's a very normal thing. So I think that's really just an interesting sort of comparison that you can make from the last time that we saw it. So that was cool and exciting. And it, as Ron said, and kind of what you guys were talking about, just like everything seems to be peaceful. It seems to be a pretty happy place right now. And that's not exactly what we're used to in Game of Thrones King's Landing. So it'll be interesting to see part of the story that leads to the King's Landing that we know. I mean, we eventually know that it, burns to the ground. So it'll be interesting to see that sort of beginning of that process. But yeah, I thought it was a fun way to introduce the dragons right off. And like I said earlier, it sort of reminded me of some of those sky shots we had at the end of Game of Thrones. So I think they're doing a lot of interesting sort of parallels while also making it still feel really fresh and different, which again, I think is a really hard line to sort of balance. But I think, one episode, they're doing a pretty good job so far.
Yeah, I mean, my biggest takeaway is just, man, look at that budget on screen, baby.
It looks more expensive.
It looks so much. This entire episode looks more expensive, but that sequence in particular, you're just like, wow, the way you're really getting a really quick overview of all sorts of different locations very fast. The last thing I want to note here, and I don't know if we need to talk about it too much, but we did also get introduced to Rhaenyra's mother, Emma, who have a really brief exchange about the nature of motherhood, sort of reminds me of some of the conversations, I don't know, one of the Starks, probably Ned Stark, had with Arya in season 1 of Game of Thrones, where he's like, yeah, one day you're going to be birthing kids. And she's like, nah, I don't know about that. I did want to move on to talk a little bit about the introduction of Viserys's, King Viserys. I want to make sure this is clear. This is the first Viserys, not to be confused with the maniac older brother of Daenerys, who was killed via golden crown melted on top of his head. So this is the one he's named after. Like all kings, they have to have a small council. And I think if we could think back at Game of Thrones, that was always like one of the fun things of, oh, there's a new person on the throne, or there's a new hand. Who's going to be the new small council? And it just seemed like it was perpetually. There was a few staples, like Pycelle stayed there for a really long time, and then Baelish was there for a pretty long stint. And Varys was there for a while. But all the other positions were constantly changing. And it was always fun to see sort of the different dynamics when they would bring in different characters. Seeing how Tyrion ran it versus how Tywin ran it. Versus what was his name? Qyburn ran. So it's just kind of fun to see the different hands and how they ran that meeting. So let's meet the new squad here, or maybe it's the old squad since this is a prequel series. We have the Hand of the King, Sir Otto Hightower, again played by Rhys Ifans. Again, as I noted last week, aka the Lizard from The Amazing Spider-Man, or Spider-Man No Way Home may know him. So the lizard face may look familiar. Or Luna Lovegood's father from Harry Potter, as Austin pointed out last week. We have the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, Rian Redwind, who's played by Gary Cooper. We have the Grand Maester Malos, who is played by David Horowitz. We have the Master of Coin, Lyman Beesbury, who's played by Bill Patterson. We have the Master of Law, Lionel Strong, Gavin Spokes. And I don't know, I was a little unclear on what his position was, but we have Lord Corlys Verlion, who, again, was the one with the big braids and the really, like, white, I'd say white hair, whitish blonde braids. And then you had, not there, but clearly very important, Daemon Targaryen, played by Matt Smith. He has had a few different positions. Formerly the Master of Laws and of Coin, and now he is the head. He's been charged with building the new city guard, essentially, which, as we know, will become the Gold Cloaks in Game of Thrones. So naturally, Daemon, again, is a no-show, and instead he's sitting on an Iron Throne, where he's actually discovered by Rhaenyra. More on that in a moment. This seems like a character I want to stop and pause about and talk about here, which is Daemon. He's the real big character reveal, or introduction, I should say. Because not only has he been tasked with building the city guard on what appears to be one of his early missions, if not first mission, where the city is introduced to this new guard, his men kind of go out and do the raping and the pillaging for the criminals. Castrations, bloody murders, decapitations. some would call him a law and order type leader. You know, this is, people wonder what law and order looks like. Probably something kind of like this, especially.
Not the show.
Of course, he is reprimanded by the small council for his extremely aggressive tactics. And I'm combining a couple different scenes here, but just want to kind of get an overview of what did you guys think of Daemon's introduction here? Lauren, I'll start with you.
I thought Matt Smith is chewing up the scenery here. And I think that he's a character that immediately seems off, immediately seems like there's something going on here. And you can really see and feel his kind of seething resentment and jealousy for not having more authority. And you can kind of already tell that there's the kind of links he'll go to kind of flex that, resentment. And he just has villain painted all over his face, in his expressions. But for me, he's one of the most interesting characters from this, and definitely the driving force of the conflict, at least as it appears from the first episode. So
certainly the most dynamic on screen.
Mm-hmm.
Daniel Stoll, what did you think of Daemon Targaryen?
Yeah, I think I pretty much agree. I think that definitely seems to be set up as the sort of antagonist, as Lauren was saying. But also in Game of Thrones fashion, we have those scenes where he's with Rhaenyra, where they seem to have a pretty good, or at least care for each other. And that seems to be like a genuine care for each other. So there is just this element of like grayness that's like kind of scattered in there, which I appreciate because it makes him a little more dynamic, as you were saying, Caleb. So yeah, I think that he definitely is the standout of this episode. Obviously doesn't seem like to be a great person, but in the way that I seriously at some points was my favorite character, I could see this character also becoming like one of my favorites, despite the wicked things he does.
Like Cersei.
Yeah, exactly.
She's great at terrible.
She's great being evil. I will say I lean more towards him being more like a Jaime than a Cersei. Again, jury's out. I genuinely don't know fates with him, but he's a charmer, I can tell. He also seems to have a lot of internal conflict boiling, as you see in the scenes in the brothel, where he actually doesn't say that much and he can't finish because he's got things on his mind.
Yep.
So, there's a lot internally going on there. Like you said, Laurent, resentment. But I also wonder about the scheming. Him being banished from the city, he probably should have seen coming. And as we're going to get into in a little while, I almost wonder if his sort of move to kind of toast his dead nephew was, I have a couple different theories about it, but one of them that is somewhat intentional. Because if he did in fact do that, which I think it's actually questionable whether he did.
Sure.
I kind of wonder if it's somewhat calculated, because you would know, people would find out that.
It seems like the kind of thing that he knew would get back and wanted to see how that would play out. It's like he's using it as fuel to motivate himself to do whatever he's going to do next.
Exactly. Or to test to see how far he can push his brother. Because I think the other thing that's clear is he has absolutely shouldn't say no respect. He has little respect for his brother Viserys specifically as a ruler, not as a brother. In fact, I think as a brother, he demonstrated quite a bit of respect, especially during the funeral scene. There is that softer side that we see creeping in Daniel, as you alluded to there. But definitely the most watchable, I have to say. Matt Smith is, he's a scene stealer. We'll get to it in a little bit, but the next episode title, it seems to imply we're going to be seeing a lot more of him next week. Let's move on to talk a little bit about some of the other characters we meet here. So in a brief scene, under a weirwood tree in King's Landing, another nice little difference there. We never saw those weirwood trees, which again, listeners, for those of you who aren't familiar, those are the giant white trees with the red leaves that have the crying faces on them that are actually connected to the three-eyed raven. We have one of those down in King's Landing, which we did not in Game of Thrones. But underneath the tree, we have Alicent Hightower, which appears to be Rhaenyra's friend, or at least study buddy. And the young version of Alicent is played by Emily Carey. And again, you kind of get a little bit of a sense in this scene, less about Alicent and more about Rhaenyra, where she is sort of has this internal conflict where it seems like she has a political mind with she has certain ambitions. She's starting to kind of construct well, here's what I would do if I were the heir, while simultaneously realizing that she wants to make her father happy and he wants a son, which he's gone out of his way to tell everyone several times. So anyway, just a quick little introduction there. I also want to take us on the note to what I would call the woes of King. So a few different things we see in this episode. Number one, hey, this guy has some sort of infection on his back that, you know, in true, like, sort of like careless king manners, like, nah, it'll go away. It's fine. It's no big deal. I just pricked myself on the Iron Throne, which, hey, boy, man, that's a lot of sharp points. Might get infected. That's a clear, I think, seed planning that he's going to get infected with something. And as I noted a second ago, he has a strong desire for a male heir. So he confesses to his wife that he has had a dream of a son ruling, which, you know, again, is always a good sign when you're bragging about your dreams. And we find out in another scene between him and his wife that she has already lost several possible heirs due to miscarriages. I just want to get you guys' quick take on King Viserys. What do you guys make of him as a ruler? Daniel, I'll start with you.
Definitely interesting. I don't think he's straight up like a bad king. In fact, I think there are some scenes where it seems like he does have some genuine care of wanting to be a good king. I think that he's obviously the misogyny is there and the sexism that exists about wanting a son, even at the expense, as we'll see later, of his own wife. And so definitely a complicated character. But I think I feel like there are some elements of him where there is some wanting to be a decent ruler for the people, quote unquote. So I don't know. He's another one that I feel like I will be interested to continue to watch and see where his story takes him.
Definitely a different kind of king than we've seen before on Game of Thrones. Everyone else on Game of Thrones seemed like they really wanted that throne. So, Laurent, what was your take?
Yeah, it seems more like something he has to carry. You know, he doesn't. He seems to have a moral compass, but he doesn't. You know, this isn't something that he kind of feels like. You know, he doesn't have a thirst for power here. It's more so just to sustain, you know, what's happened and to uphold what's come before. He does seem very protective of that position, at least, is that not inviting just any one person to try and shake things up. He wants somebody that's going to, for sure, uphold the same moral compass, what of it that he has. Moving forward.
Yeah, I think he definitely, as we'll get to in a little bit, has a very strong sense of purpose and belief in the Targaryen heritage, and he's very proud of that. He's a very proud king. Mm-hmm. But also, I think I actually think Daemon's got a point here. I think he's actually pretty weak-willed. He can be very easily persuaded by his counsel. So again, that's a different type of king than what we've seen previously. I mean, you have Robert Baratheon, who was stubborn. You know, after that, we have Joffrey, who was a monster. And then after that, we get Tommen. I guess Tommen would probably be the closest to, but he was a puppet. You know, that's the thing about Viserys is he does have ideas and things that matter to him. He's not just kind of going through the motions and doing exactly what everyone tells him, but he can be very easily influenced by those around him. And I think it sounds, as Daemon points out, he's pretty out of touch with the people. You know, he's not aware of what's going on the ground level. I want to get to the tournament next. And this was a really impressive sequence, but I just want to, before we go any further, want to note, unlike the show, which did not give any sort of warning, I just want to give a content warning. We're going to talk about childbirth a little bit and how awful the show portrays it. So just, if that in any way triggers you, just maybe skip ahead by about 10 minutes and we'll move on right through it. But just wanted to note that because it is a very integral part of the tournament sequence. They had to give us some sort of spectacle, right? And I think this is another example of like, wow, look how much more budget they have and how much talent they have working on this show. Because if you think back to season 1 of Game of Thrones, there was a tournament, but it was like real simple. I mean, really simply shot. Didn't look bad, but this looks like, I don't know if
it's spectacle.
Spectacle.
Sure.
Laurent, I know you and I saw the Last Duel.
That's what came to mind to me too.
Daniel, did you see The Last Duel? That's the one with Matt Damon and Ben Affleck.
No, I have not.
Great movie. Check it out. Very underrated.
Yeah, I'll have to see it. But no, I've not seen it.
And also now streaming on HBO Max. I swear they should pay me money for selling them their service. But highly recommend The Last Duel. It was one of my favorite movies of last year. But I say that to say, yes, it was spectacle. It looked like of the caliber of The Last Duel, which is a movie that cost $100 million.
Right. And made a fraction of that.
Tragically. That's why you all need to go watch it, because it was a great movie that like no one watched.
They all went to House of Gucci, and we saw how that went.
Yeah, I know.
Same director. But anyway.
Father, Son, and House of Gucci. So as the tournament roars on, Viserys is summoned to Queen Aemma's chambers, where she is experiencing complications in birth. And Viserys is given a choice of whether or not to try and save the baby, or they both die, right? So, they say it's an impossible choice. So, really quickly, before we get to the more intense sequence, just wanted to get you guys' quick thoughts. Laurent, you and I pretty fired up. We think it looks great. Daniel, anything else you want to add about the tournament? Like just how it all was shot, edited, put together?
No, I thought it was cool. Obviously, in the first season of Game of Thrones, we have that tournament, but obviously, like as you guys are saying, it's on a much grander scale. It feels like here, the way it's shot. At the beginning, I thought it was just going to be this sort of fun sequence, but obviously, it turns into something way darker.
Yeah. So one thing I just want to note about this, part of the inclusion for the tournament was they knew Miguel Sapochnik said in that sort of making of, he's like, we wanted to give everyone a taste of what was possible in this new Game of Thrones series. So it's sort of his way of saying you ain't seen nothing yet. But also, I think they cross-edited it with this birth sequence, which is upsetting. But I think with the goal they were trying to get at here, again, as I talk about in the making of, was for women, the birthing table is the battlefield. So they wanted to kind of cross-cut this baby being born in a very tragically violent manner with sort of here in the birthing room, there is tragic death that is basically uncontrollable at this point with the resources they have. Cross-cut with the battlefield where people are senselessly dying for sport. And in fact, I think at one point, the queen that never was even like leans over and says, none of these guys have even seen battle. So these people are just killing each other just for fun. While, again, in the birthing room, this woman is dying, essentially. Just want to note, we're all men around this table. So just want to preface that. None of us have given birth or will ever give birth, so just keep that perspective in mind. That said, the sequence is especially intense and a reminder of how cruel Westeros is, especially to women. Lauren, I want to turn to you. I mean, do you think this cross-cutting the tournament with the death of Aemma and childbirth, does this work well to articulate the point that they were trying to get at?
Honestly, yeah, I think so. I mean, I feel like it's upsetting, but I think it's intended to be upsetting. And I felt like the cross-cutting between that and the tournament was actually a really good visual juxtaposition, because like you said, Aemma says, to her daughter at the earlier in the episode, like you mentioned, that the childbed is the battlefield, and so they quite literally are cross-referencing that with battle, showing it, and I think it just really drives that sentiment home, and also showing, like you said, again, like this cruelty towards women, and how at all costs, I mean, obviously, and I think in her case, she's going to die either way, but there's no regard for any kind of consent of sorts, or even just a mere mention that, hey, we got a choice to make. She's just completely blindsided by what they're going to do, and so just that disregard for them, the humanity of the woman, is definitely present. And I think to not show that would do a disservice to the series, because as we see throughout the series, I mean, that sentiment is carried, throughout the rest of it. So I think downplaying it would probably would be disingenuous to what we can come to expect from this series and that mentality.
Right. Again, this is Game of Thrones. It's part of one of the things it's known for is the brutality. So you think that it is warranted in this case?
Yeah, I think it's warranted. Yeah. All
right, Daniel, what was your thought on this sequence?
Yeah, I think Laurent sort of nailed that on the head. I think that just the sheer brutality of this scene, for me, I think is probably one of the hardest scenes I have ever had to watch, even considering all of Game of Thrones. I think it was just really, really the way that it's cut and the way, just the sheer, how tragic this is. And even though it's only just one episode, obviously we don't know these characters super well, I still felt the weight of that in the scene. So yeah, just establishing that yes, this is still the same horrific world that and I think Laurent also hit on this point too, which I was going to say, is the fact that Viserys doesn't talk to her at all about what's going to happen, even though from his perspective he's trying to save the baby or whatever, just just to go in and act like everything's okay and normal or whatever. It's just so like gross. And so, yeah, and I agree that it really just establishes the sheer horrificness of this world and how the treatment of women and how consumed this character is with wanting to have a son and an heir and maintain power in the family, that sort of thing. And it really just establishes that and it really well. So I do think it's like necessary despite how hard and tragic and difficult it is.
Right. So I will say it was super hard to watch. I was actually somewhat prepared for this sequence to a degree. Obviously, I wasn't. How can you be fully prepared? But I'm really plugged in online where there's just so much conversation around speculation about the show. And as you all are aware, Game of Thrones kind of got a rap for being pretty harsh on women, including how they portrayed sexual assault on a couple different occasions throughout the show. And a lot of people don't like that, to be clear. I think that's fair. I sometimes agree with them. It's all like highly contextual. Sometimes I kind of lean more towards the creative side where I say, well, you really got to look beyond just the sequence. And there's other times where I'm like, yeah, no, you're totally right. That was uncalled for. Yeah, we don't need to get into nitty gritty. We talked about those sequences extensively on the Cast Beyond the Wall earlier in the series. But because of that, the producers and showrunners Miguel Sapochnik and Ryan Condal both got asked about this on the press tour about sort of how is the show going to handle sexual assault. So according to the producers in a Vanity Fair interview, they, after getting nailed, after I think it was a Hollywood Reporter tweet, they took frankly, I think they had a right to be upset because it took a quote way out of context and blew it up on Twitter, which is, it was honestly kind of slimy social media strategy. Anyway, they came back and said, well, I'd like to clarify that we do not depict sexual violence in the show. And that's what one of the producers said in that Vanity Fair interview. They also said, we handle one-off instance off screen and instead show the aftermath and impact on the victim and the mother of the perpetrator. However, on the same press tour in a separate interview with Entertainment Weekly, the executive producer Miguel Sapochnik said about childbirth, it's as dangerous as it gets. You have a 50-50 chance of making it. We have a number of births in the show and basically decided to give them different themes and explore them from different perspectives the same way I did for a bunch of the battles on Thrones. Again, this is the guy who did the Battle of the Bastards, was probably the grittiest when he did. So I'm of two minds about this, honestly. On one hand, Game of Thrones does have that nasty history of brutalizing women to prove a point. Again, it kind of goes back to the question of, do you agree with George R. R. Martin's philosophy that he's portraying, historical, sort of the history behind it? All his Game of Thrones is based off of, medieval politics and histories. Do you agree with that approach? If the answer is yes, then maybe you're going to have a little more leeway. If the answer is no, you're going to hate it every time. I mean, I literally have someone on Twitter I respect said, I love the episode except that one sequence. And he's like, I don't understand why they insist on putting it in there. I mean, come on, there's dragons. It's not real. And again, I think that's a very fair point of view to take. Here is my other sort of thought about it. Disclaimer being, again, a male who has never had to bear a child. In a time where Roe v. Wade has just recently been largely overturned and women across the United States are losing the ability to get proper birth control, it really occurred to me that we haven't had a ton of representation in media that is demonstrating the risks and just how painful childbirth can really be, especially when not conducted in a hospital. Yes, there are impossible decisions that have to be made when women are not in hospitals or given proper birth control. And I'm going to put it out there. I'm not going to sit here and tell you, this is the right way to do it. I'm just thinking about, have we done the portrayal of birth and deaths at birth justice on the screen? Because in a lot of ways, it seems like maybe the reason it's so easy to take away those rights to women is because people like men just genuinely don't understand what the risks are. Yeah. And just a question I want to put out there. I think it's really going to come down to each individual to decide whether this works for them or not. I personally, in this scenario, I'm going to lean more towards the artist, LaRon, and sort of the artist intent and say, I think that they are trying to make a very clear point, cross-referencing senseless violence with helpless violence, or like helpless death that is just uncontrollable.
I always think when it's in service of a critique, then yes. If it's just to glorify violence, if it's just to degrade women for sport, then no, I think that's wrong every single time. And I've always said this, like I like horror films, I like gore, blood and guts, like in movies, but I don't like violence that doesn't serve a larger purpose. And so if I'm seeing violence, I'm like, yeah, as long as there's an intent for it. If there's a rape scene in a film, then I hope that rape scene has something to do with the larger story or the arc of this character or what have you, or a critique of this universe in some way. So I would say in service of a critique or a social commentary, yes. But just to throw it in there for shits and giggles or just to be for shock value, then no, I think that's gross.
Yeah, you and I are on the same page. And I do think they are making a very clear point to show how complicated it is, to show the, patriarchy and the misogyny. Again, Viserys doesn't give his wife the autonomy or the agency to even contribute to the decision. And
the kind of complications in things that Rhaenyra is ultimately going to be faced with, when you have a patriarchal system and men who don't respect women in power, like what kind of threat is she going to be surrounded by, in that sense. And I think that establishing that threat palpably, is important too, because otherwise, she'd be able to reign and do whatever she wants to, but we know that's going to come with the burden, it's going to come with unforeseen burdens because she's the first to do it. So,
yeah. Again, can contribute to that world building too. And like you said, helping set the stakes for Rhaenyra, who, is being positioned to be the main character here. So with all that said, we're going to move on to the heir. It's time to name an heir. So after, the death of Aemma and his son Balon, there's a funeral scene, which I thought was really beautiful. Otto calls a small council meeting to reopen the conversation about the heir. Super quickly, by the way. It was like the same day as the funeral. He's like, all right, I hope you mourn. But we're all really worried you're going to get murdered tonight. So who's the heir? This is, again, Otto Hightowers is the one who calls the meeting and is pressing for them to make this decision so quickly. So I kind of see this as a classic Game of Thrones type exchange. So Daniel, what was your read on where the different members of the small council position their allegiances in this decision about the heir?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting how quickly, to me, it felt like Otto clearly doesn't like Daemon. And so it was very quickly, it seems like there was something going on from his point of view or his perspective where he clearly doesn't want him to have any more control or power than he already does. And he's very quickly trying to squash that. To call back quickly to the funeral really quick, I did think there was I really liked the subtle element of how Rhaenyra is the one that sort of steps up and makes says Dracarys and is the one that begins that process. I felt like there was a little bit of a subtle nod to her ability to lead, whereas the other characters weren't doing that in that scene. But anyway, back to the council. Yeah, for me, Otto was the sort of suspicious character in this scene. I think that he does not want to see Daemon have any more power or control, and was really quickly trying to squash that. Was my biggest takeaway from this scene.
And I think, again, Otto making a quick power play. Laurent, what was your take on this sort of exchange in the small council?
It is interesting because, again, it's going back to that inherent misogyny where it's like they're having this conversation like he doesn't want Daemon, but and he doesn't, and clearly, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But the alternative being, having a woman heir, also presents some hesitation from everybody, and so there's this like, where do we go from here? There's this, there's a lesser of two evils here, but they're still not sure how to weigh their options with the two they have. And so it's just an interesting interplay, with everybody. And it just kind of shows also all of their, in essence, a lot of their true colors and a lot of their intentions with this. So, and yeah, I find it very interesting. I agree with them about Otto seeming the most suspicious of the group for sure. Like there seems to be more of an agenda there than with some of the other council members. So,
Right. And we should also note that Daemon was listening in the whole time, by the way.
Right.
You know, they don't know that, but he was totally listening in on the entire conversation and all the trash talking they were doing of him in that moment. The one thing I just want to call out, yeah, I'm totally with you guys. Otto is definitely the one pushing a specific agenda here because he's trying to keep Daemon out. In fact, I think he's been trying to push Daemon out of the council entirely, probably for years. But I also want to call out that Lord Corl's Verlion, initially it was like, well, do we want a woman ruler? And then like after they talk about it for a second, he's like, well, my wife is the queen who never was. And they're all like, wait a second. And they call him out on it. They're like, wait a second. You just said you didn't want a woman leader. You know, I thought that was kind of a fun, just like the way, again, like how they all are trying to play multiple sides at the same time.
Devil's advocate and backpedaling.
Yeah. Just thought that was a fun exchange. And then lastly, this is probably the strongest reaction we get out of Viserys the entire episode. He refuses to have to choose between his brother and his daughter. He doesn't feel the pressure that is being put upon him is fair, which I think is interesting because it kind of, is a callback to the beginning of the episode. Jaehaerys Targaryen, it was almost like an election rather than, him picking one or the other. So again, at the end of the day, selfishly, he decides to name his daughter his heir eventually, but only after he finds out that Daemon has pushed his limits too far by apparently toasting to the death of Viserys' dead son, Balon, raising a glass in the brothel, saying, "To the heir for a day, Balon Targaryen." So from there, we get a really heated exchange between Viserys and Balon. So real quick, I mean, what did you guys think about this back and forth? Laurent, I'll start with you.
I felt like this was very telling of both characters, but I think that the tension between them here, it's very clear that Viserys does not trust this person, and nor should he if he truly did say this thing. And I think it shows to him also like just how temperamental this person is. And it just further validates for him that he is the wrong person to be there. And so even if he's not so warm to the idea of having a female being in power, it's at this point seems like at least I trust this person. I at least trust her, and I'll deal with the ramifications of that before I allow this person who would, gloat at the death of my child, to be in power, because clearly his judgment is cloudy. So,
yeah, I think not only does it show that Viserys does not trust Daemon, but also that Daemon does not respect him as a leader. Again, there is that sort of like hint of, you're my brother, so I'm there. I respect you as my brother, but you're a weak ruler, And they're both pretty honest about how they feel about each other in that moment. Daniel, what did you make of this exchange?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's interesting because there's a lot of talk about the Targaryen. Laurent used the word temperament, and like that we heard a lot about how the Targaryens, 50-50 chance whether they go mad or whatever. And so it's interesting to see that, as we were talking about earlier, that seething sort of resentment that exists in Daemon in this scene a little bit, but also it's interesting to know all that and have Viserys be not, for the most part, was not overly, emotional until this final moment. Yeah, I think it's, I think it makes sense what Viserys does, and this is the sort of the moment that pushes him to be able to say, I would rather have, my daughter who I can trust and I think can be a good leader than someone who's willing to be so dismissive of, family. And I think in the scene later where they talk about the thickness of blood, of the dragon's blood and the thickness of that and stuff like that. And I think this is, for Viserys, for me, what I'm reading is that Daemon is not being a good brother or a good family member, and that's not acceptable for him. So that is where the line is for Viserys.
It's like the final thing that he's able to use as leverage to finally get over his own misogyny about the idea of that, of even allowing that to happen. It's like, all right, this is the last straw. This is the one. I mean, at this point now, I got to take, go down this rabbit hole that I've never been, because I can't allow this to happen. Which again, to me, felt like the debate that people were having in 2016. It was like, I hate both of these people, but damn it, only one of them actually knows how to do the damn job. You know what I mean? Like, so it's like so that tension that people had with the two pitted against each other. It's like, how do you pick the lesser of two evils? We'll go with the one that has a resume.
Well, and even back at the council, when Viserys is sort of defends Daemon a lot for his actions with the cloaks or whatever, but then I think the family is the difference, sort of like you all mentioned earlier with maybe not caring so much for the people, just keeping, it's more about the family. And so, yeah, I think that's really the turning point for him, is that family comes first, even more so than the people that they're leading.
Yeah, again, I just think it just goes to show that there is a brotherly love connection there. Again, we saw it from Daemon during the funeral where he urges Rhaenyra to go say Dracarys, I mean, I think I do really believe he loves his brother, but at the same time, and I think it goes both ways. That's why it's sort of like, no one picks on my little brother but me, sort of thing.
Yeah.
I want him to be a part of this rule.
Yeah. He loves him, but he doesn't respect him.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's mutual.
On both sides. Yeah.
Now, here's the one thing I'm going to pause it, guys. Notice how you don't actually see Daemon saying that. They actually you see him start to raise a glass and they cut away before you actually see him saying that. Now, that's probably just a creative decision, but it does sort of plant the seed of, did he really say that? Because who brought that to light was Hightower, who clearly wants him out of the picture. And he's like, I heard from a reliable source and corroborated that with a couple of other reliable sources, and they say he said this. Now, here's the thing. Daemon doesn't... So this is where I kind of come back to. I don't know that he actually said this.
Yeah.
He doesn't defend himself, but maybe it's like one of those...
Because he's asked directly, and he doesn't say no. It's just, but he probably left that sentiment in that when he's confronted with, he's like, oh shit, he's like seeing through me, right. So that sort of thing, but go ahead.
Or maybe he was offended that his brother would imply that he would say that. Yeah. I guess it's like, I love that they decided to edit it that way, because it has my head going in like 3 different directions at one time. It's like, ooh, is this a caliber? Because it seems like a really dumb thing to say, like in the open at that time. So it's like, oh, is this a very calculated decision? He wants to get ran off so that he can validate his whatever he's going to do next to probably get vengeance or whatever. But I don't know if that's true. But maybe this whole thing is just cooked up as a way to get him pushed out, in which case I feel like the lack of a response is, how dare you? I can't believe that you think that of me. But it is also
very manipulative. Yeah.
Yeah. But again, in that moment, it's kind of weird. Like, why would you not deny it? I don't know. I can't wait to see where this character goes, because this specific scene in particular is the thing where I'm like, ooh, there's questions. There's a lot of dramatic potential coming away. Did he say it? If he did, why? If he didn't, that means Hightower lied, and it gets a political machinations. Yeah. Regardless, it's only going to fester the resentment that he has towards his brother Viserys. But yeah, anyway, I thought that was cool. That takes us to one of the the end of the episode where Rhaenyra is named the heir. Now, here's what I just want to pause here. We get a really nice long monologue from Viserys to Rhaenyra, but this is where we get a direct tie-in to Game of Thrones, which was something is not, from what I understand, is not in Fire and Blood, and is a show invention that is George R. R. Martin approved, of course. And this is where the exact thing her father says. He goes out of his way to paint the throne as a burden, which I think is also another really interesting take. He's not like, this is a privilege or look how awesome being a king is. He says, this is a mission. And this is why this job's super important. And he says, our histories tell us that Aegon the Conqueror looked across the black water from Dragonstone because he saw a rich land ripe for capture. But ambition alone is not what drove him to his conquest. It was a dream. Just as Danish saw the end of Valyria, Aegon foresaw the end of the world of men. And it begins with a terrible winter gusting out of the north. Aegon saw absolute darkness riding on those winds, and whatever dwells within will destroy the world of the living. And when the great winter comes, Rhaenyra, all of Westeros must stand against it. And if the world of men is to survive, a Targaryen must be seated on the Iron Throne, a king or a queen strong enough to unite the realm against the cold and the dark. Aegon called his dream the Song of Ice and Fire, and this secret has been passed from king to their heir since Aegon's time, and now you must promise to carry and protect it. So it's one of those dun-dun-dun. The Targaryens knew all along, or believed this prophecy so much that it fueled their entire conquest of Westeros.
Yeah.
So I have more thoughts on that in a moment, but Laurent, I want to turn it to you here. I mean, what did you think of sort of this tie into the Song of Ice and Fire? And I should actually note, he says all this and then clearly shows his bling with that dagger, the cat's paw dagger, the one that Arya Stark will one day use to kill the Night King. So what did you think of sort of that nod to Game of Thrones?
I think it's a great inclusion, and I think it adds some nice dramatic weight to the preceding events, because we know obviously how this pans out. We know where it goes. We know if this, this is the prophecy that we see, come to fruition at the end of Game of Thrones. And seeing the dagger, I just love that is such a subtle way because immediately there's 4 reference points, throughout the series where you're like, oh yeah, because with Bran, and then with, I love that without spelling it out. If you've seen the show, then the reference point of that, just it does, it kind of symbolically connects these two universes and connects this narrative that we've seen, and it was very fun. It was a fun nod.
Yeah, no, agreed. Daniel, what did you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was an exciting connection to, as Laurent was saying, to the end. We know what this prophecy is if you've seen Game of Thrones, and how that comes to fruition. I do think it is interesting how he brings up this secret about a dream when he was talking earlier in the episode about having a dream about having a son. It does, I think, provide a little bit more of depth to why he was. There's this element of believing in these dreams as being prophetic, and so I think it doesn't change that much, but even just referencing back to where he was talking about having his own dream about having a son and how certain he was that their next child would be a son, it does provide a little more of understanding of why he, may have had that, felt so convicted about that perspective that he had. So I thought that was also a little interesting element to him sharing this family secret.
Yeah, no, I mean, here's the thing. I think it's I think it's another one of those examples of I think it's a good way to do a prequel, right? In that it adds information that I think enriches what we already knew, which is, hey, no wonder they didn't believe this. This very vital information at some point was broken between all the turnover between different kings, whether it was the Targaryens or maybe they made it as far as Robert Baratheon. Once they killed the Mad King, well, there goes the secret. It's a little unclear on how many of those generations it stayed intact. But I think it's really compelling because you're thinking about the Targaryens. Think a lot of themselves. One, that they are the only ones who can unite the Seven Kingdoms, which I'm going to get to in a minute. But B, that speaks to, Daniel, your point, a core theme of Game of Thrones, less so in the show, more so in the novels, which is prophecy and how they are often destructive. We see it several times in Game of Thrones. Again, reading the novels more specifically, there's the dreams that Dany has. We see her in Game of Thrones. Of course, you have the House of the Undying prophecies she sees where she sees herself in the throne room as it's snowing. And the show does eventually fulfill that with a dark twist of that's also where she dies. Mm-hmm. And you also have things like Cersei Lannister, it was foretold that she would be the queen, but she'd lose all her children. And again, this is a little more prevalent in the novels than in the show, but because of her fear of losing them, she actually causes most of them to die in one way or another, right? Yeah. She is in some way responsible for their deaths because she is just so obsessed with trying to prevent bad things from happening to her family. So again, this is a really great through line. And it also kind of provides a little more context on where the origins of some of these other prophecies, like the prince who was promised, again, significantly lesser prominent in the show as it is in the novels, which we know eventually is going to go on to be Jon Snow. And this is also the one that Melisandre was looking for, the one who would combat the great other. So again, all these, it adds like a little layer of like, oh, this thing's been around for a long time. They know about it. And they are, at least the way they tell the story, they're the ones who originated it. Now, here's one thing I want to hit on, though, that we haven't talked about yet, which is, gosh, aren't the Targaryens really into themselves? The Targaryens believe they're the only ones. There has to be a Targaryen on the throne for them to defeat the great evil. And it really had me thinking about another concept in American history, Manifest Destiny. Are you guys familiar with Manifest Destiny? Sorry. Okay. So for listeners who aren't as familiar, just really quickly, according to history.com, Manifest Destiny, which is a phrase that was coined in 1845, is the idea that the United States is destined by God, its advocated beliefs, to expand its dominion and spread democracy and capitalism across the entire North American continent. And this philosophy was what drove the 19th century U.S. territorial expansion and was used to justify the forced removal of the Native Americans and indigenous groups from their homes. And the rapid expansion of the United States intensified the issue of slavery as new states were added to the Union, leading to the outbreak of the Civil War. Why do I say this? Well, it's not one-to-one, but the presumption from a Targaryen that only a Targaryen must be on the throne to, quote unquote, unite, like strike that, edit, invade and rule the Seven Kingdoms to beat the White Walker implies that the Targaryens really think they are like the chosen ones, right? In reality, the only thing, and I think this is kind of a core theme that we've seen in the marketing materials and maybe hinted at just a little bit in this episode, but the reality is the only thing that separates Targaryens from all these other houses and royals are the fact that they have dragons. That's literally the only thing that separates the two. Yeah. But it just paints a really interesting picture about what has motivated this house to like just go all out and really have these wars, over time. LeBron?
Well, I was going to say that's an interesting commentary too on just privilege. The idea of like we have this one thing that edges us out over other people, but what separates us, you know what I mean? Like, me versus a poor person, whatever, it's very small, insignificant things, but it's just enough. You know what I mean? To create this wall between us and them. And I like that they at least articulated themselves that they're aware of it too. They say this, that we, that's all we have, take that away from us and we're like everybody else. And I really like that, that distinction, so, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's the thing that's frustrating though. They're aware of it, but they still they still sort of, at least Viserys buys into the idea this is sort of like some destiny that must be upheld by the Targaryen household, while also simultaneously being like, yeah, but we're just like everyone else, basically, just ordained by, I guess, the gods. Daniel, anything you want to add about that?
That's a great point about the privilege. I hadn't really thought about it from that perspective, but I think that is that's a really insightful point. I think as a straight white man, I am very privileged. So it's interesting that to see that they are able to, like you said, identify that. But I think even, is it Viserys or Daemon that says it's something about the we can control the dragons is an illusion or something like that. So yeah, that's an interesting point. I hadn't really viewed it from that point of view, but I think that definitely fits and makes a lot of sense at a way to view them at this point in the story.
Yeah, I think as we kind of go further in the show, I'm really excited because I think it just adds more context that we really didn't have. We kind of got the vibe
Yeah.
Based off of especially how Dany and her brother Viserys talked, that they thought a lot of themselves. But I did have the genuine question. I was like, well, were they all that way? Or was it just because Viserys was the young Viserys in Game of Thrones? Was it because he was like a spoiled brat, and he just passed that along to Dany? And this kind of clears it up at least a little bit. There's an underlying philosophy that I'm curious to see how it comes to a head across different family members throughout the season.
Yeah.
All right, so guys, let's start to wrap up. I do have a few things I want to hit on here really quickly, but let's just put a pin in it really quick in terms of recapping the episode. Did the Heirs of the Dragon get you fired up to see more of Westeros, Daniel?
Yeah, I think that this was a good, solid opener, and I am pretty excited to see where these characters are going and how they're going to solve some of the issues that have already begun to arise between them, and how this Targaryen family decides to navigate this whole heir conflict. Yeah, I think I'm in.
Very nice. And Daniel, also, are there any specific characters that are emerging as an early favorite for you?
I think I kind of already alluded to this. I think despite him not being a all-around good person, I think Daemon is the most interesting character so far. So out of just one episode, I think I'd have to lean toward him being my favorite to watch, I guess I could say. I also feel like there is something interesting about Viserys, despite how complicated this opening episode was for him, that I'd just like to see where it goes from there. Because in the end, he does make the decision to choose his own daughter as the heir, which is the first character that we've seen get, despite what it took him to get past that a certain level of misogyny that does exist. So I don't know. I'm interested to see how his character may change or grow as the show goes on.
All right. Well, LaRon Chapman, are you excited to see more of Westeros, and which character may be your favorite so far?
I am. I think it's the perfect combination of world building, character development, and spectacle that they were able to pack into that hour and 10-minute episode. That's what I want from a pilot. And so it delivered on that. I'm really happy that it didn't turn into just kind of a cheap spectacle that, that just again streamlines the series for us. That they're actually going to take some time to develop this world and these conflicts in this universe. And so that gives me excitement to see more of Westeros. I think, similarly, I think Daemon's the most interesting character to see, not because I think I like him, but because I think he's the most interesting character. He has the most stakes, the most dramatic weight here. And I also actually really liked Rhaenyra. I thought she was a compelling character, and I'll be curious to see how she takes on this big role, because I know it was really important to her to be seen as somebody that to make her father proud, and she's getting this opportunity to finally do that. And so what she's going to do with that will be interesting.
Yeah, no, I'm totally with you. I think, LaRon, you already said everything that I would say about the pilot. The one thing I'd add is not only was this an excellent pilot first episode that kind of hooks you with, like you said, the trifecta, the world building, the characters, the drama, and the spectacle. I also like that it's not a super slow burn where it's like, well, you gotta wait like 3 or 4 episodes before it really hooks you. I'm like, no. Like they get you from the go. They get you from.
We
the
get
jump.
enough conflict for sure
Yeah.
to keep things moving for sure.
Yeah, I gotta say, it's got me back. I really didn't think I was gonna get super re-enthused about Game of Thrones. The promos for this were good, and I was like, maybe. But wrapping this conversation up, talking with you guys about it, and really sort of breaking it down, I am super excited to be back in Westeros. I'm super excited to be doing the podcast again. I think we have a great show ahead of us, at least if the first episode is an indicator. And yeah, I mean, Daemon, most interesting character, hands down. I'm also interested to see, I think I said this in our preview episode, purely based off the actor, I'm really interested to see how Hightower shakes out, because he's a really well-known British actor that I like. And again, a couple things we kind of passed over pretty quickly, but we did note that right after he had that meeting where he was pushing for them to choose an heir, he sent a sealed note to Old Town, which is where the Citadel for longtime viewers may remember, that's where Samwell Tarly went in season 7 of Game of Thrones. That's where all the Maesters train and study. So I do think that he's playing his own game to a certain extent. He's got his own motivations, and it on one hand, it seems like he's very pro Viserys, but it's only because they're old friends that we would tend to think that he might be up to something a little more mischievous. So we'll see. And all right, guys. So as part of a news segment, we're going to wrap up each episode by awarding honors to various characters or things in the episode. So the ones that will have every episode: who wins, who loses, and who is the biggest wild card of the episode. There's no fantasy league this year, so we're going to simplify a little bit and start there. So LaRon Chapman, I'm going back to you. Who wins this week? Who loses this week? Who's the wild card?
I think Rhaenyra wins. She seems to be the one that's gained the most from this episode, beneficial at least as of now. And then I think the loser for me, I kind of went back and forth with this about maybe it being Daemon, because he does get banished. But I really think that Viserys is actually the one that loses the most this episode. You know, he loses his wife, he loses his son. You know, he's dealt with these impossible decisions where now he has to deal with the conflicts of having his daughter be thrown into power. So I feel like he loses the most here at this moment. And then I think the wild card for me is Otto Hightower, because there's something stewing there with him. He seems a little bit more mischievous, as you said, and that there's something more to be seen there. So,
also another thing we didn't mention about him is that he sends his daughter to comfort the king and has her dress in his wife's dresses, which is icky. And very strategic.
But is that indicative of the time and the space? It's still wrong. It's still gross and everything. I was just wondering, like.
But yeah, you're right. But also, it's a politically calculated move, right? It is of the time for sure. But I also
how he's inserting it in this moment, for sure.
Yeah. So again, mischievous.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Daniel, how about you? Who's the winner? Who's the loser? Who's the wild card?
I definitely approach this a little bit differently. I think I approach this more of like, after watching this episode, who won? I guess I would say Daemon, not in the sense that obviously he lost a lot, but Daemon as a character wins because I'm most interested in him. So that's how I kind of took that approach. I actually, for this week's loser, I put Alicent Hightower because of what you had just mentioned. I think that there's maybe something interesting going on between her with Rhaenyra, but obviously when she gets sent into Viserys to be with Viserys, she lost a lot there. So that's what I went for the loser. And I actually agreed on the wild card is Otto. I think that there's something going on. He seems to have a little bit of an agenda. That would be my wild card.
All right. So I'm going to shake things up additionally as well. I'm actually going to put this week's winner as Otto Hightower, Hand of the King, because his goal was, as I see it, was clearly to get Daemon out of the small council. And by golly, he did it. And I would say Rhaenyra, yes, she is the heir now, but I don't think the way her father kind of positions it as a burden, it's like you have this great thing that you're going to do, but it's a huge burden too. She wins from a power perspective, but does she win as a character? Not totally clear about that. So that's why I went with Otto Hightower. He's doing some maneuvering, and at least one of his goals was achieved this episode. The loser, reproductive rights, especially for the women of Westeros, aka Emma in particular, because she died. But I say reproductive rights because, guys, we didn't mention there's a full-blown castration in this episode, which is also wowza uncomfortable. Like, just they went harder with the gratuity, I feel like, than most of the Game of Thrones series, just to make sure we know that they
were watching it.
Yes,
you are watching this show.
And my wild card is Daemon Targaryen, because while he was banished, I still suspect that he didn't totally lose in his mind. I think that whether it was intentional or not, him being removed is going to help him feel more empowered to do whatever it is he's going to do next. And also, this week's special award that I'm presenting, Victim of Creative Choices Awards, which is the iconic opening credits sequence. Because, by the way, there was no opening credits sequence specifically in this episode. I mean, I don't know about you guys. I was literally...
I was waiting for it.
Yeah. Before the episode started, Lauren, I was like, I can't wait to see what they do. I mean, it's like such an iconic... It's won Emmys and stuff. I can't wait to see what they do with it. Well, good news is, according to Vulture.com, it will be starting next week.
Okay.
So it kind of gives this whole episode sort of definitely a pilot feel, but almost like a prologue.
Yeah.
And I know there's a prologue.
The whole episode is a cold open.
Yeah, exactly. That's what it feels like. That was kind of my take. Yeah. So I can't wait to see what they do next week, and hopefully we'll be saying nice things about it. All right, gentlemen, to conclude our episode quickly, let's talk about next week's episode. I could not find a synopsis, but I did find a title. The title of season 1, episode 2 of House of the Dragon is The Rogue Prince. Before I realized it was reckless to do Google searching about these names and things, I can tell you that the title refers to Daemon Targaryen. There's actually a whole short story based on of this title that is floating around out there, written by George R. R. Martin. So I think it sounds like Daemon may be we already all said that he's the most watchable in this episode. It sounds like he might be even more prominently featured in next episode. So Daniel, what are you expecting or thinking we might see next week?
Yeah, that's exciting that we're going to get more of him. I think that we will see, where does he go? How is he plan to respond to being, banished from King's Landing? And does he have a plan? Kind of what you said, was this part of the plan? How does he respond if this wasn't part of the plan? So I'm excited to see his response.
All right. LeBron Chapman, any other thoughts, predictions, questions about the title?
Yeah, I think I'm mainly just excited to see if he did or didn't, if this whole thing was calculated, as we've kind of alluded to, throughout the episodes. That is he more meticulous and motivated with this, or if he really is, if he really did say it and he really did, what is the intention behind all of that. And to see what conflicts that he's going to present for our characters moving forward. So,
all right, very cool. Well, I can tell you one thing I hope we see next week, more dragons. We did see 2 dragons. We saw Rhaenyra's dragon and we saw Daemon's dragon. Daemon had a really bright red one. It reminded me a lot of Volvagia from the Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time boss fight. But, so we got yellow, we got red. I know that's one thing George R. R. Martin was really pushing. He wanted more colors in the series. Notice even amongst the houses, the color palettes were a lot more prominent than they were in Thrones, where it was more washed out grays and dark colors. So it's kind of cool to see the different dragons that clearly had more variety than the 3 we saw in Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
All right. Well, guys, this has been so much fun. Thank you so much for taking some time out of your evening to talk about the first episode of House of the Dragon. Where can people keep up with you and the things you're doing online? LeBron Chapman, we'll start with you.
You can follow me on my name on Facebook, or if you'd like to read my reviews, my film reviews, you can follow me on Letterboxd at black_Cinna_man.
Nice. Do highly recommend Letterboxd. Great app for tracking movies. It's seriously been a game changer for me over the last 5, 6, 7 years. I don't know how many years I've been using it. A long time. Helps you track your movies. You can read reviews from your friends and see what they think of the same movies that you just saw. Daniel Stoll, how about you?
Yeah, I have gotten rid of most of my social media at this point in my life. But if you do want to reach out, I still do have a Twitter at Daniel Stoll 23. The number's 23.
All right, very cool. And of course, you can find me tweeting about all things film, television, and video games over on Twitter at CMastersTalk. That is letter C Masters Talk. Or chiming in on Letterboxd once or twice a week at CMastersTalk there as well. And again, do highly encourage you to check out that app. And of course, you can follow the Cast Beyond the Wall on Twitter at cast_beyond_GOT, or on Facebook at facebook.com/Cast Beyond the Wall. Seriously, guys, what did you think of this episode? I'd love to hear from you. Did you have any theories? Do you have any thoughts? Any questions? Throw those questions or thoughts or comments at us by sending us an email at castbeyondthewall@live. That's live.com. Ron Chapman, the Tenderhearted, thank you for joining us. Daniel, as always, sir, thank you for joining us. Tune in next week when we continue our journey beyond the wall. And until then, All I have to say is the gods have yet to make a man who lacks the patience for the next episode of a great TV show.